My name is Dr. Louise Owusu-Kwarteng. I'm a program leader in sociology and combined honours at the University of Greenwich. So my research area focuses on the attainment of Black and minority ethnic students, but with particular emphasis on children of West African origin. So from the 1950s and the 1960s, we saw an increase in the number of Black children Black migrants coming into the country. So they had children, and their children were going to school in the UK system. So there were two issues emerging from this. Firstly, the perceptions about how they would integrate into the education system, but also ideas about their academic abilities. So these were often perceived to be negative and perhaps rooted in ideas which came from the colonial era, whereby Black people's intelligence were graded according to their race, and Black people were seen to be at the bottom. So this shaped the way in which the teachers interacted with them and also perceived their academic outcomes and ideas about their behaviour. So Heidi Safia Mirza, for example, she talks about the whole perceived ineducability of Black children, and this is where these notions came from. Furthermore, there were issues about the way in which Black families were perceived. So they were seen to have a pathological structure, more likely to be single-parented, and if they were single-parented, then the mother would be out working and they wouldn't be able to watch their children's behaviour or their academic attainment. And unfortunately, a lot of research tends to sort of reinforce this idea. So it was very key in the 1970s and the 1980s, and we're still seeing this idea now. So in terms of my research, I was keen to challenge these ideas. And what I did was I did interviews with 25 British Ghanaians. So their parents came to the UK during the 1960s, 70s and 80s. And I did what I call life history interviews. So they were reflecting on their socialization experiences, so then I could get some insight into their family structures, the attitudes in which their parents had towards academic attainment, and how much this was based on their parents' own experiences of this and where their own socialization experiences in Ghana, and how they saw this as impacting on their own academic and socio-emotional outcomes as well. So I think the key thing here, as I say, is to challenge those ideas about the pathological Black family, the negative underattainment of Black and minority ethnic children, and also the way in which we're homogenized within sociological research of educational attainment and professional development. I'd say another driving force behind my research was something that happened to me back in 1993 when I was 17 or 18. So I was a sixth former at the time, and I was doing my A-levels, and they weren't going particularly well. And I think this was partly because I needed to, it takes time to transition from A-levels to GCSE, from GCSEs to A-levels. And it was taking me longer, and I think the way in which we were being taught didn't necessarily help. But anyway, one morning, I was having a conversation with one of our tutors and with the careers people, and I was told to consider going to work, or to go and work in a factory, or if I really must do anything, a career, go in as a nurse, because it would do, and he rubbed the back of his hand just to show that he meant about me being Black. And I was furious. I was really upset. And when I get upset, I tend to cry. I can't help it, but I cry. So anyway, I went home and I was really worried, because I thought, oh, what's my dad going to say about this? Because is he going to think that I failed as well? But he was very, very sympathetic. I mean, he said, do you want to leave that school? And I said, yeah, I do, because I know that if I stay there, I definitely will fail my A-levels and I'll never get to university, and I really want to go. So the next week, my dad took me out of the school. He let me go to the college that he worked at, and I have to say that college did not have a very good reputation in Nottingham. I won't name it. But I went, but saying that, I did sociology and psychology there, and it was like night and day. My teachers were very different. They were very supportive. They were saying that you could get A and B grades in your A levels, and my grades just shot up. I felt so much more confidence in myself, and that was just simply because of what my dad said, but also because they had the confidence in me, and I actually got what I was doing. The teaching was a whole lot better. So when I was conducting my research, I drew on a model which examined parenting styles, and this was by somebody called Diana Barmrind, who talked about 3 different parenting styles. So there was authoritarian, authoritative, and permissive. So I used that in my research, and I do recognize that it's not always easy to categorize, but from what my analysis was saying, this was the best approach to analyze it. And some of my respondents indicated that they'd had an authoritarian parenting style, whereby the parents were very strict, they had very high expectations of them, there wasn't so much flexibility over certain things, lots of emphasis on discipline. But whereas others had had a more authoritative parenting style, where things were a bit more flexible, there was more sort of agreement in terms of rules and regulations, but then they also had high expectations of their children and their academic outcomes, but none of them were permissive, none of the parents were permissive. But in both cases, the children or the participants came out very well academically, and also in terms of their professional attainment as well. Again, there are pathologic or negative ideas about the way in which Black parents raise their children. And the dominant idea is that they use an authoritarian approach which restricts their individuality and really has a negative impact on the children's behavior, which translates into the education system. So a lot of research tends to reaffirm this, but I'm arguing that actually this isn't necessarily the case, because not all Black parents do use an authoritarian approach. They may be more flexible or authoritative in their approaches. And also, even if they do use an authoritarian approach, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, because what this does is enables the children to develop discipline in other areas of their life, their academics, when it comes to just reaching goals, etc. So I'm challenging this perception in my research, and I'm arguing from personal experience, and also from the people that I'd spoken to. A lot of them were saying that they'd had this authoritarian approach, and yes, sometimes they resisted against it, and they didn't always like what was said and the way that things were done, but at the same time, this benefited them, and this has helped them academically and in terms of their careers. But for those who didn't experience it, again, who had an authoritative approach whereby the parents were more flexible, they gave them more autonomy, but they still had high expectations of their abilities, they did just as well as those children who'd experienced an authoritarian method. If anything, the authoritarian children did better because of that extra discipline that they had. All of my participants, their parents came from Ghana. They came in the 60s to the 1980s. And these parents had been born and raised during the colonial era. Now, at that point in time, I would say that there was always a lot of emphasis on academic attainment back then, partly because at the time in which they were growing up, Ghana was coming towards independence. So there was some positions coming available for them to take the roles which the colonizers had. And for those people who were in those roles, they'd gone on to higher education, often in the UK and other parts of the West. So this is why they were seen as more capable of doing those roles. So this was something that a lot of the parents aspired to. So this is why they came to the UK for their education. So the plan was they'd be here for 5 years, and then if they had children, everybody would go back and occupy those roles. So I think it's important to challenge, to consider, to understand these styles, because it's too simplistic to say that if you've had authoritarian parenting, you're going to have emotional problems, it's going to impact on you negatively academically. Actually, I think it's far more nuanced than that. You have to look into the situation a bit more, in more depth, and to recognize that it's not going to be the same, and there's a reason why some parents use this approach. And also to avoid the generalization that all Black parents will use an authoritarian approach, and this will impact negatively on their academic attainment. So, all right, I'd say there are other factors helping attainment, and I think one of the things that a lot of the participants talked about was the role of the Ghanaian community. And when we talked about this, I also grew up in a very close-knit Ghanaian community, and there was an unspoken rule that it takes a village to raise a child, really. So they'd be very interested in what the children were doing academically, and in some cases whether they were fulfilling expectations and what things could be done to facilitate this. Also, some of them were talking about how they went to Saturday school, and I myself went to what we called Ghana school, just to sort of make sure that we had a strong sense of our culture. So we were British, but also that we knew where we were coming from. We knew how to speak the language, or as much as we possibly could. Anyway, so that helped us shape our identity, because I think without having that sense of identity, this could cause all sorts of other problems which could have ramifications for other parts of your life. So I think that was very important. One participant said something that was quite funny, because he was saying how with Ghanaians, they have a penchant for funerals on a Saturday night, and he's right about that. So you can go to different parts of London and you can just go to a funeral, you can go and eat, do whatever, even if you didn't know the person that died. But at these funerals, what they tended to do was they tended for the community to get together, and they talk about the dead person, but also talk about their children and what their children were doing academically in terms of career. So it was a kind of little bit of a boasting session, but then also it kept everybody on their toes. So you had that, I mean, you had that pressure because everybody knew what it was that you were doing, and that was another driving force. So in terms of capital, a lot of research tends to say that we don't, as Black and minority ethnic groups, we don't have the correct level of social or cultural capital. So that is that of white middle-class family or upper-class families. And I have a slight issue with that, because I think that we need to broaden the way in which capital is understood and the way that it's looked at, because people use what they have. I mean, with white middle-class families or upper-class families, they use what they have access to in the same way as Black and minority ethnic people do. So we use the community, we use those people who have had experience of certain things. So, for example, in my research, I found that some Ghanaian children were able to sort of get into careers, get into insights about what it would entail by speaking to people who had gone through that career, letting them mentor them and guide them through. So I'm just thinking of one in particular that was keen to go into nursing. So other members of her family were nurses, so they guided her in terms of how to apply for a nursing career, what it would entail, etc. So now she's doing very well. She's a child nurse now. So I think these are key things. So in terms of what I hoped my research is to gain, so first of all, I think it's to rethink that dominant narrative about Black attainment. So firstly, to recognize that we can't homogenize everybody. Not all Black groups are the same. So there's differences within and between Black groups with regards to attainment. So even if we're talking about African Caribbean groups, not all people from African Caribbean groups will do the same. So we need to recognize those differences. The same with African groups as well. And also, I think we need to kind of offer more of a balance in terms of the way that we look at it. So try to not focus so much on underattainment. Recognize where there is attainment, where people are doing well, because this would help to shape policy, help people to understand what it is that these particular groups are doing to shape and enhance attainment. And another thing I'd say is that there needs to be more dialogue between the education system and Black and minority ethnic families, because, as I've said before, there are pathological perceptions about the way in which families run, the way in which they raise their children. So I think if there was more understanding, more dialogue, perhaps this might help to reduce and dispel these myths over time. And I think they're the two key things that I would hope that my research helps to bring about.